Today we're going to do a recap on slope and how to calculate slope. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is slope. And so remember we talked about slope being the ratio, which means we're going to be talking about a fraction. So it is going to be a fraction, and it's a fraction that compares the vertical change, vertical meaning up and down, to the horizontal change, meaning we're talking about moving left and right. And so we often say that is our change in y over our change in x, or we can also call that our rise over our run. So those were all ways that we talked about slope. We do have 4 types of slope. So remember, when we are looking at our slope, if it rises from left to right, like you're going uphill, that would be a positive slope. If you're reading from left to right and it's going downhill, that is going to be a negative slope. If it is a flat line, our slope is going to be, and when I say flat line, we're talking about a horizontal line, your slope will be 0. And if it is a vertical line, our slope is undefined. Keeping in mind that undefined is also represented with a 0 with a slash through it. So there's actually no slope for a vertical line. And then we talked about how to find slope 4 different ways. We started by finding slope from a table, and we talked about finding the change in y over the change in x. So we always asked ourselves, how is y changing? And so we would look and we would say, okay, to get from 8 to 5, I subtract 3. To get from 5 to 2, I subtract 3. And to get from 2 to negative 1, I subtract 3. And so my change in y is negative 3. So we have a negative 3 over, and then we looked at our change in x. To get from 1 to 3, I added 2. To get from 3 to 5, I added 2. And to get from 5 to 7, we added 2. And so our change in x is a positive 2. And so our slope for this specific problem was negative 3/2. So the slope here is negative 3/2. Then we talked about how to find slope from a graph. And so from a graph, we always counted our change in y over our change in x, which we then said, hey, we can call that the rise over the run. And so we're talking about how do we move up and down, and how do we move left and right. And so you're going to choose a point to start with. So if I start with the ordered pair 1, negative 2, and I go up to the point negative 2, 3, I have to go up, so my change in y is going to be positive. I have to go up a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. So my change in y is 5. And my change in x, from there, I have to go left. So since I'm going left, my change in x is going to be negative. And I actually have to go over left 1, 2, 3. So my change in x is going to be negative 3. And so my slope there is negative 5/3. Because a positive divided by a negative is a negative. So my slope is negative 5/3. Then we talked about how to find slope from 2 points. And so when we have 2 points, we could graph them on a graph and count our slope. But we also talked about how when we talk about change in y, we talked about how change in means to subtract. And so we talked about how we would subtract our y values. We would take y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And my suggestion to you was to name your points. Name your first order pair x1, y1, and your second order pair x2, y2, so that you wouldn't get confused. And so in my case, y2 is -6, and I'm going to subtract y1, which is -2. So I'm taking a -6 minus a -2. So I started with my y2, which was -6, and I'm subtracting my y1, which is -2. So I took -6 minus a -2. Remember, minus a negative really means to add a positive. So a -6 plus a +2 is going to give me a -4. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom, or my denominator, except this time I'm going to start with my x2. And my x2 is 7. And I'm going to subtract my x1, which is 4. And 7 minus 4 would be 3, so my slope is -4/3. And then last but not least, we talked about how to identify slope from an equation. So remember when you were in slope-intercept form, which is y equals mx plus b, the letter m represents your slope, and so my slope in this case would be 1/2. If we are in standard form, we need to solve our equation for y so that we can identify our slope-intercept form. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get the y by itself. So I want to move my 3x over to the other side of my equal sign so that I can start isolating my y. So I'm left with 4y equals a -3x plus 12. And then I would divide everything by 4. And so I would get y equals -3/4 x plus 3. Notice that when we are in slope-intercept form now, my slope is the m, or the number in front of x. So in this case, my slope is -3/4. So those are the 4 different ways we talked about how to identify or calculate slope.